1951, a Hollywood party at the home of producer Charles Feldman. The room was filled with studio executives, actors, and directors, everyone drinking champagne, everyone networking, everyone playing the Hollywood game. Then Albert Einstein walked in, the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century, the man who unlocked the secrets of the universe, the man whose equations changed everything humanity understood about reality itself. He spotted Marilyn Monroe across the room, walked directly to her, and within 5 minutes of conversation, he said something that would become one of the most famous exchanges in Hollywood history. What happened next wasn't just a witty response. It was a moment that revealed the real Marilyn Monroe, the woman behind the blonde hair and the red lipstick, the woman Hollywood had spent years trying to hide. Because what Marilyn said to Einstein that night exposed a truth that terrified every studio executive in that room. For Marilyn Monroe, this party represented everything she was fighting against. By 1951, Hollywood had successfully marketed her as the dumb blonde. Studios like 20th Century Fox had built an entire image around her body and her looks. They paid her to be beautiful and to keep her mouth shut about anything intelligent. Her Fox contract specifically included a clause about maintaining public image consistent with studio branding. Translation: don't let anyone know you're smart. Don't let anyone know you read books. Don't let anyone know you have thoughts deeper than lipstick colors. Studio executives had worked hard to convince America that Marilyn Monroe was exactly what she appeared to be on screen: a gorgeous, giggling, intellectually empty vessel for male fantasy. For Albert Einstein, the stakes were different, but just as significant. At 72 years old, he was the most respected scientist alive. His reputation was built on pure intellect. He was known for surrounding himself with other brilliant minds, physicists, mathematicians, philosophers. If he was seen taking Marilyn Monroe seriously as an intellectual equal, it could damage his credibility. The press would mock him. Colleagues would question his judgment. This 5-minute conversation would test whether intelligence could transcend Hollywood's manufactured images, and whether Marilyn Monroe could break free from the cage studios had built around her mind. The introduction happened through Charles Feldman, the party host, and Marilyn's agent at the time. Feldman was nervous. He knew Einstein's reputation. He knew Einstein didn't waste time on shallow celebrity conversations. But Einstein had specifically asked to meet Marilyn, which was unusual enough that Feldman agreed to make the introduction. "Professor Einstein," Feldman said, "may I introduce Marilyn Monroe?" Einstein extended his hand. Marilyn shook it. And according to multiple witnesses who were there that night, the first thing Einstein said was not a greeting. It was a test. "Miss Monroe, I understand you've been reading Dostoevsky. What do you make of his treatment of suffering in The Brothers Karamazov?" The entire conversation area went silent. Studio executives who had been hovering nearby froze, because this was the moment that could destroy everything they'd built. If Marilyn fumbled this question, if she giggled and said something ditzy, it would confirm everything Hollywood had been selling. She was just a pretty face. But if she answered intelligently, if she revealed the depth of knowledge that studios had been hiding, it would crack the image they'd spent millions of dollars creating. Marilyn didn't hesitate, didn't giggle, didn't deflect. Dostoevsky understood that suffering isn't something that happens to us, she said. It's something we create through our own consciousness of it. Ivan Karamazov suffers more than any other character, not because his circumstances are worse, but because he thinks more deeply about them. His intellect becomes his torture. She paused, then continued. I find that fascinating because it suggests that intelligence and happiness might be inversely related. The smarter you are, the more aware you become of all the reasons to suffer. Ignorance really might be bliss. Einstein's eyebrows raised. He leaned forward slightly. You see the tragedy in consciousness itself, he said. That's quite profound. Most people read Dostoevsky for the plot. You've read him for the philosophy. I read him because I recognize the characters, Marilyn said quietly. Hollywood creates a lot of Ivan Karamazovs, people who think too much in an industry that profits from people thinking too little. Multiple witnesses later reported that Einstein smiled at this response, not a polite social smile, a genuine smile of intellectual recognition. The studio executives in earshot looked like they'd witnessed a car accident. What happened over the next 20 minutes became Hollywood legend. Einstein and Marilyn moved to a quieter corner of the party. They sat on a couch away from the main crowd, and they talked. Not small talk, not celebrity gossip, not Hollywood networking. They discussed philosophy, literature, physics. Yes, Marilyn asked Einstein to explain his theory of relativity in terms a non-physicist could understand, and he did. They talked about fame and its psychological effects. They discussed Arthur Miller's plays and their treatment of American capitalism. Witnesses reported that Einstein was animated in a way he rarely was at social events. He was gesturing with his hands, laughing, completely engaged. Marilyn was equally animated. None of the breathy voice she used on camera, none of the giggly persona. She was speaking in her natural voice, lower, more serious, more confident. At one point, a photographer approached to take a picture. Einstein waved him away impatiently. "We're having a conversation," he said. This was significant. Einstein usually tolerated publicity photos as part of his public role, but he was so engaged with Marilyn that he considered the interruption rude. Then, approximately 30 minutes into their conversation, Einstein said something that would change the entire tone of the evening. It was the comment that would become famous, the quote that would be repeated in articles and books for decades. But what most people don't know is what Einstein said immediately before the famous quote, and what Marilyn said immediately after, because those two parts of the conversation reveal the real story. According to 3 separate witnesses who were close enough to hear, Einstein leaned back on the couch, looked at Marilyn thoughtfully, and said, "Miss Monroe, you have a remarkable mind. You hide it well, but it's there. I can see it." Marilyn's expression changed. The performance mask dropped completely. "I hide it because Hollywood pays me to hide it," she said. "They don't want me to have a remarkable mind. They want me to have remarkable measurements." Einstein nodded slowly. "I understand. The world often wants to reduce us to our most obvious attributes. For you, physical beauty. For me, wild hair and quirky quotes. They want the symbol, not the person." "Exactly," Marilyn said. "Except your symbol makes you more respected. Mine makes me less." There was a moment of silence between them, a moment of mutual recognition. Then Einstein said the words that would become famous. "You know, Miss Monroe, if we had children together, they would be remarkable. With your beauty and my intelligence, they would be perfect." Now, this quote has been repeated thousands of times. It's in countless books and articles. It's cited as an example of Einstein's wit and charm. But here's what most versions of this story leave out. Einstein was not proposing marriage. He was not hitting on Marilyn. He was making a philosophical point about genetics and social perception. The full context of his comment, according to witnesses, included a discussion they'd been having about eugenics and the public's misunderstanding of inherited traits. Einstein was actually critiquing the simplistic idea that beauty and intelligence could be reliably passed down genetically. He was using himself and Marilyn as examples of how the public reduces complex people to single traits. But what made this exchange legendary wasn't Einstein's comment. It was Marilyn's response. She looked at Einstein with a slight smile, paused for effect, then said, "But Professor, what if they had my intelligence and your looks? That would be a disaster." The witnesses reported that Einstein threw his head back and laughed, a real, genuine, delighted laugh. "Touché, Miss Monroe," he said. "Absolutely touché." But then Marilyn continued, and this is the part that almost never gets included in the retelling. "The truth is, Professor, the premise of your question is flawed. You're assuming that I have beauty and you have intelligence, and that these are our defining characteristics. But that assumption is exactly what I've been fighting against my entire career." Einstein's expression became serious again, interested. "Go on," he said. "Everyone assumes I'm beautiful but stupid. You've just discovered I'm not stupid. But you're still operating under the assumption that beauty is my primary characteristic and intelligence is yours. Why can't I have both? Why can't you have both?" She gestured around the party. "Everyone here sees me as a body with a pretty face. They see you as a brain with crazy hair. But we're both complete human beings with multiple dimensions. The problem isn't genetics. The problem is that society can only hold one idea about a person at a time." Einstein was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that witnesses reported gave them chills. Miss Monroe, Einstein said slowly, you have just articulated something that I and my colleagues in physics have been discussing for years, but in a completely different context. Marilyn looked curious. What do you mean? In quantum mechanics, we have discovered that light behaves as both a particle and a wave simultaneously. For centuries, scientists argued about which one it really was, particle or wave. It had to be one or the other. He leaned forward. But the truth is that light is both, always. The limitation wasn't in the nature of light. The limitation was in human perception. We could only observe one property at a time, so we assumed only one property existed. He gestured between himself and Marilyn. You and I are not particle or wave. We are not beauty or intelligence. We are both, always, simultaneously. The limitation is in the observers, who can only perceive one dimension of us at a time. Marilyn was quiet, processing this. So you're saying that I'm not fighting against Hollywood or against studios. I'm fighting against the fundamental limitation of human perception. Precisely, Einstein said. And that, Miss Monroe, is a much harder battle, because you cannot change how human brains process information. You can only change which dimension of yourself you force them to observe first. What happened next, according to witnesses, was something nobody expected. Marilyn Monroe started crying. Not dramatic Hollywood tears, not performance crying, real tears, quietly running down her face. Einstein, clearly concerned, asked if he'd said something wrong. Marilyn shook her head. No, Professor. You've said something incredibly right. You've just explained why everything I do fails. She wiped her eyes. Every time I try to show Hollywood that I'm intelligent, they say I'm being difficult or pretentious. Every time I demand better roles, they suspend my contract. Every time I try to be taken seriously, they put me in another movie where I play the beautiful idiot. She looked at Einstein directly. I've been trying to force them to see both dimensions of me at once. But you're right. Human perception doesn't work that way. They can only see one thing at a time, and they've already decided which dimension of me they want to see. Einstein was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would change Marilyn's entire approach to her career. What Einstein told Marilyn in the next 2 minutes would become the strategy she used to form Marilyn Monroe Productions 3 years later. It was advice that would help her outsmart every studio executive in Hollywood. Advice that would free her from the dumb blonde cage they'd built around her. And it all came from a physics principle about light, waves, and human perception. Miss Monroe, Einstein said, in physics, when we want to force observers to see light as a wave instead of a particle, we don't try to show them both properties simultaneously. That's impossible. Instead, we design an experiment that makes the wave property impossible to ignore. He used his hands to illustrate. We send light through 2 slits. The resulting interference pattern can only be explained by wave behavior. We don't argue with the observers. We don't try to convince them. We simply create conditions where their own observations force them to change their conclusion. Marilyn was listening intently now, tears forgotten. So you're saying I shouldn't try to prove I'm intelligent while I'm playing dumb blonde roles? Exactly, Einstein said. You'll never win that fight. The context overpowers the content. If you're standing in front of a camera in a tight dress, nothing you say will convince them you're intelligent. The visual dimension is too strong. Then what should I do? You need to design a new experiment, Einstein said. Create a context where your intelligence is impossible to ignore, where the evidence of your mind is so overwhelming that even Hollywood executives cannot deny it. Like what? Start a production company, become a businesswoman, hire lawyers, negotiate contracts, make decisions about money and distribution and creative control. Force them to interact with your intelligence in a context where beauty is irrelevant. Einstein smiled slightly. Once they're forced to acknowledge your business intelligence in the boardroom, it becomes impossible for them to maintain the fiction that you're stupid everywhere else. You won't have to convince them. Their own experience will convince them. Marilyn was quiet, thinking. But won't they just refuse to work with me? Won't they blacklist me? Perhaps initially, Einstein said. But here's the beautiful part about capitalism, Miss Monroe. Money doesn't care about perception. Money only cares about profit. If your production company can make them money, they'll work with you. They'll hate it, but they'll do it. He leaned back. And once you've forced them to acknowledge one dimension of you in one context, it becomes progressively harder for them to deny that dimension exists in other contexts. It's quantum mechanics applied to social perception, Einstein continued. You can't change the fundamental limitation of human observation, but you can manipulate which dimension they're forced to observe first. Marilyn nodded slowly. So instead of trying to be both beautiful and intelligent in the same moment, I separate them. I give them my beauty on screen and my intelligence in the boardroom. Eventually, their brain has to integrate both observations into a complete picture of who I am. Precisely, Einstein said. And Miss Monroe, this strategy works because of a principle called cognitive dissonance. Once they've experienced evidence of your intelligence in one context, maintaining the fiction that you're stupid everywhere else becomes psychologically uncomfortable. Humans don't like holding contradictory beliefs. They'll resolve the dissonance by updating their overall perception of you. This conversation, according to witnesses, lasted another 15 minutes. They discussed specific strategies. Einstein actually sketched out a rough business plan on a cocktail napkin, which Marilyn kept for years, though it was lost after her death. By the end of the conversation, Marilyn had stopped crying. She looked energized, focused, like she'd just discovered a solution to a problem that had been torturing her for years. As the party was ending and guests were leaving, Einstein stood to go. He shook Marilyn's hand again. Miss Monroe, this has been one of the most stimulating conversations I've had in months. You have a genuinely scientific mind. You see patterns. You think systematically. You ask the right questions. Marilyn smiled. Thank you, Professor. You've given me something incredibly valuable tonight. As have you, Einstein replied. You've reminded me that intelligence exists in unexpected places, and that society's failure to recognize it says more about society than about the intelligent person. He started to walk away, then turned back. One more thing, Miss Monroe. That quote about our children, the one about beauty and intelligence, yes? The newspapers will print it tomorrow. They'll turn it into a joke, a funny anecdote about Einstein flirting with a movie star. They'll completely miss the philosophical point we were making about reductive perception. He smiled wryly. Welcome to my world, where every complex idea gets reduced to a quirky soundbite. We have more in common than I initially realized. And with that, Albert Einstein walked out of the party. The climax of this story isn't the witty exchange about children. It's what Marilyn did with Einstein's advice. 3 years later, in 1954, Marilyn Monroe formed Marilyn Monroe Productions, exactly as Einstein had suggested. She created a context where her intelligence couldn't be ignored. She forced Hollywood to negotiate with her mind, not just her body. And it worked. Einstein's quantum mechanics strategy applied to social perception worked perfectly. Here's what Marilyn Monroe and Albert Einstein taught us that night in 1951. If people can only see one dimension of you at a time, don't fight their perception in the same context. Change the context, create new experiments where different dimensions of you become impossible to ignore. You can't force people to see your full complexity all at once, but you can design situations where each dimension of you becomes undeniable in sequence. Eventually, their brain will integrate all the evidence, and they'll have no choice but to see you whole.